All right, let's jump right in today. We're talking ancient Greece, and for all you military history buffs out there, you're in for a treat. Yeah, when you think about ancient Greece, you gotta talk about the lay of the land. It's almost like their geography had this master plan for warfare. And that's how we got all these city-states. Okay, so break it down for us. How did the terrain actually, change the game? Picture this. Mountains, islands everywhere, and a coastline that's just begging for harbors. This wasn't a place where you could just build some giant empire like what was going on in China around the same time, right? I mean, conquering this place meant controlling a bunch of little pieces, not one big and meat territory. So we're talking like smaller, quicker armies instead of these massive forces just rolling across open fields. Exactly, and that's where the whole idea of the city-state comes in, right? Each one was like its own little country. They had their own gods, their own laws, and get this, their own army. It's like the land itself was saying, hey, no emperors here. We do things a little differently. You've got all these independent cities constantly competing, almost paranoid about their neighbors. That must have had a huge impact on their politics and how they developed their armies. Oh, absolutely. It was like this crazy pressure cooker of innovation. They had to figure out how to defend themselves, and that pushed them to come up with new weapons, new tactics, and even new ways of organizing their societies. It's fascinating, really. And speaking of defense, we got to talk about those acropolises, right? Those temples on top of hills. They were just for show, were they? No way. Think of them like the ultimate safe house, like a city's last stand. When things got really bad and invaders showed up, everyone would head up to the Acropolis. It was naturally defensible, a real pain to try and conquer. Those sieges were long and brutal, so even their architecture was tied to their military needs. They were basically built for siege warfare from the ground up. But let's talk about the soldiers themselves. Who were these warriors, and what was their society like? Well, to understand their army, we gotta talk about something kind of uncomfortable, something that was a huge part of their society: slavery. And unfortunately, it was totally intertwined with their military power. You mean because it freed up all the men to be full-time soldiers? Exactly. The citizen men, they were the warriors, the backbone of the army. And that's where the gymnasium comes in, which is kind of interesting. I thought that was more about wrestling and javelins and stuff, not exactly hardcore military training. It was more than just physical training. The gymnasium, it was like a social club, a place where young men, and I mean only citizen men, could test themselves, train their bodies and minds. That's where the ideal of the citizen soldier was born. So this whole thing about women and slaves being excluded, it wasn't just about who got to train. It was about defining who had the right to protect the city, shaping the idea of citizenship itself, right? Spot on. It really highlights those lines they drew in their society, lines that had a direct impact on their military and who had the power. And we can't talk about ancient Greece without mentioning, some of the more controversial parts of their culture, like pederasty, for example. Yeah, that relationship between adult men and younger boys, it was a normal part of their world, for better or worse. And yeah, sometimes it even played into their military training. It's definitely a tough one to wrap our heads around today. It definitely makes us think about their warrior culture in a different way, about how complex their social norms really were. So we got all these fiercely independent cities, a warrior culture built on slavery, and these social norms that shaped their military. But what about their politics? How did they govern themselves? Well, that's where things get interesting, especially in Athens. It's a story of all these dramatic shifts and changes, like a pendulum swinging back and forth between different forms of power. Okay, I'm intrigued. So where do we even start? Myths and legends? Or like the nuts and bolts of how they ruled? In ancient Greece, you can't separate the myths and legends from their history. They're all tangled up. Take the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, for example. The classic hero versus monster tale. It's practically what we think of when we think of Athenian bravery. But how does that tie into their politics? Theseus, he's the ideal Athenian hero. Brave, clever, willing to face down any danger. And that kind of storytelling, it's key to understanding how they saw themselves, their leaders, the qualities they wanted in their warriors. So it sets the stage for the very real story of King Codrus, which sounds almost too dramatic to be true. It's pretty epic, right? Imagine Athens is in trouble. King Codrus gets a prophecy. It says if the enemy kills him, Athens will win. So what does he do? He disguises himself as a regular soldier and runs straight into danger, sacrificing himself to save the city. That's intense. Talk about leading by example. Well, his sacrifice, it completely changed the Athenians. They were so moved by it, they decided no one could ever be as good as Codrus, and they abolished the monarchy. Well, a king dies, and they get rid of kings. This is huge. It totally changed their political landscape, the start of something new for them. But of course, just because they didn't have a king anymore, it doesn't mean they suddenly became a democracy. That's a whole other story. A story filled with power struggles. Yeah, and new ideas. A story that leads to a totally new way of governing. And for those of us who love military history, this is where things get really interesting. Oh yeah, stay tuned because we're diving deep into the wild world of Athenian politics and the birth of a system that would change the world. Democracy. So there they are, no king. Know how to move right, but someone's got to be in charge. Yeah, so who steps up? Did they try to find a new ruler, or did they try something totally different? Well, first they come up with this archon thing, basically like a governor. Seemed like the obvious choice, right? Someone's got to be the boss. Sure, but they just got rid of a king. I can't imagine they wanted to replace one ruler with another. You're telling me. These first archons, they were picked from the fancy families, the aristocracy. So basically the same folks still had all the power. And the everyday people, well, they were too thrilled about it. So getting rid of the king wasn't the big change they were hoping for. Not exactly. They wanted to say, they wanted to be part of how things were run. And all that frustration led to some real power struggles. Remember that guy, Cylon, the merchant who tried to take over? Yeah, wasn't his ending a bit, rough? I mean, they put his head on display as a warning. Talked about sending a message. That's ancient Greece for yo. Cylon's little coup, it failed back in 632 DCE. It just shows you how shaky things were back then, all that tension between the rich folks and everyone else. Sounds like they're walking on eggshells trying to balance the old ways with everyone wanting change. Exactly. And then along comes Draco. He was an archon too, but this guy, he's famous for being super strict. Like death penalty for stealing a cabbage, kind of strict. Yeah, draconian measures, right? I mean, well, that seems a little extreme. What was he thinking? You gotta look at the big picture. Athens was a mess. Fighting within the city, other city-states looking to cause trouble. Just a lot of uncertainty. So Draco comes along in 621 BCE with his laws, trying to scare everyone into behaving, so more about control than fairness, huh? Just trying to keep things from falling apart. You could say that, but even back then, people knew his laws were brutal. They didn't fix the problems, just covered them up, like putting a bandage on a broken leg. Which brings us to Solon, another archon, but this guy seems different. He was all about reform, wasn't it? Totally different approach. Solon takes over in 594 BCE. Real visionary leader. He realized Athens needed more than just punishments. They needed a total makeover. Their society, their politics, the whole shebang. So he wasn't afraid to shake things up. What kind of changes did he make? Oh, he went after everything. Started with the economy, got rid of debt slavery, which is a big deal, wanted to help the poor and make things fairer for everyone. He also pushed for more trade, brought in skilled workers, wanted Athens to be booming. Smart move. A strong economy makes everything else easier. But what about the politics? Did he change how they govern themselves? That's where it gets really cool, especially for us military history nerds. Solon, he ties political power to military service. Like, how much you're involved in government depends on how you serve in the army. So basically, the richer you are, the more political power you have, and the better equipped you are for war. Exactly. The wealthiest citizens, they could afford the best gear, right? So they were the elite units, the cavalry, the hoplites, the guys with all the fancy armor and weapons. Those hoplites were the heart of the Greek army. They're heavy infantry. Ah, the hoplites. I love those guys. All decked out in bronze, marching in their phalanx formations. Iconic. And super effective. That phalanx, it was a wall of shields and spears, just unstoppable in close combat. You needed training, discipline, and the right equipment to make it work. It was a real testament to their skills and resources. It sounds terrifying like a human tank, but even with Solon's reforms, it still feels like the rich guys have all the advantages. True, but you can't deny it was a big step in the right direction. More people got to be involved in politics, and it set the stage for even bigger changes. But of course, there were still problems brewing, and that's when Pisistratus enters the picture. He's the guy to call a tyrant in the books, right? But he also did stuff to help the poor. Seems kind of contradictory. Pisistratus is a tricky one. He grabs power in the 6th century BCE and rules for quite a while. Definitely used some strong-arm tactics to stay in charge, but he also did things to fight poverty, built up the city, and was a big supporter of Athenian culture. So, a mixed bag. A tough ruler, but maybe with some good ideas. You got it. His methods weren't exactly, by the book, but he did lay some groundwork for democracy to come later. Even though he was an autocrat, he showed that a strong central government, even if it wasn't fully democratic, could get things done. It feels like Athens was always trying new things, trying to find the right way to govern themselves in a world that was constantly changing. And all that experimentation, all that back and forth, it eventually led them to something truly groundbreaking. Democracy. Democracy. The word that changed everything, that still shapes our world today. But how did they go from all this chaos and power struggles to this radical idea of the people having the power? That's where Cleisthenes comes in. He took that Athenian desire for a voice, for a say in their own lives, and turned it into a system that, while not perfect, changed the course of history. Cleisthenes. Now there's a name to remember. What did he do? How did he make democracy a reality? Cleisthenes comes to power in 508 BCE, and he immediately starts tearing down the old ways. He makes the council bigger so more people are represented. And get this, he introduces the idea of randomly picking people for government jobs. Hold on. Randomly, like picking names out of a hat. That sounds crazy. It was a total revolution. By choosing people randomly, Cleisthenes took power away from those elite families and gave regular Athenians a chance to be in charge. I mean, it sounds chaotic, but also kind of brilliant. Did it actually work? It wasn't always smooth sailing, but it did work. And Cleisthenes had another trick up his sleeve. Ostracism. If enough people thought someone was a threat to democracy, they could vote to kick them out of Athens. It was a way to keep powerful people in check and protect the system. So the people really did have power, a way to hold their leaders accountable. That's amazing, even by today's standards. It was like nothing the world had ever seen before. Now let's be real, Athenian democracy wasn't perfect. Women, slaves, foreigners, they couldn't participate. Only a certain group of men had a voice, so not exactly the fully inclusive democracy we think of today. Nope. But even with those limitations, Athenian democracy was a huge deal. It gave us this idea of a government that gets its power from the people. It was a seed that would grow and change over time, inspiring all sorts of different forms of government. It's incredible how this system, born out of their unique geography, their political battles, and their military needs, had such a lasting impact on Western civilization. It's like necessity really is the mother of invention. You said it. An Athenian democracy, forged in conflict and shaped by their warrior culture, was about to face its biggest tests yet, because ancient Greece was never about just internal politics and reforms, right? It was about epic battles, clashes that would decide the fate of entire civilizations. And those clashes, my friend, are where things get truly epic. Stay with us as we dive into the world of the Greco-Persian Wars, a conflict that would pit this young Athenian democracy against the might of the Persian Empire. So, Athenian democracy is up and running, this brand new way of doing things. But we all know ancient Greece wasn't exactly a peaceful paradise. Right, Athenian democracy was a big deal within their society, but what really put them on the map militarily, was this huge new threat. The Persian Empire. Oh yeah, the Persians. Now we're talking epic battles, civilizations clash, and the kind of stuff that makes history come alive. It was a clash of titans for sure. The Persian Empire, with rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius, they become this massive power, conquering everything in sight across Asia Minor and beyond. Ambitious bunch. And naturally, the Greeks, with their independent cities and constant squabbling, caught the eye of these emperors who just loved expanding their territory. Couldn't be avoided, really. The Persians saw these Greek cities as easy pickings, and when they tried to take over, well, that's where we get some of the most famous battles ever. Battles that would decide the fate of Greece and have this huge impact on Western civilization. Okay, before we jump into the fighting, give us the rundown. How were the Persian and Greek armies different? How did their styles clash? Picture the Persian army. It's gigantic, a mix of soldiers from all over their empire. Like a tidal wave, they relied on huge numbers to crush their enemies. Archers, cavalry, infantry, the whole works. So like a brute force kind of thing, quantity over quality. Kind of, but they weren't just a mindless mob either. The Persians were good at sieges, their archers were deadly accurate, and their cavalry could be devastating out in the open. And how did the Greeks, especially the Athenians, stand up to this giant army? The Athenians, they were outnumbered for sure, but they had a few tricks up their sleeves. First, their hoplites, those heavily armed infantry guys, with their spears and shields forming the phalanx. The phalanx has always been so fascinating to me, like a human tank, just unstoppable. It was incredibly effective up close, on flat ground especially. The discipline they needed to keep that phalanx tight, it shows you how much they valued teamwork and training. Sounds like a force to be reckoned with. But you said the Athenians had another advantage, right? Yeah, their navy. The Athenians put a lot of resources into their ships. They knew whoever controlled the Aegean Sea had a serious advantage. Their triremes, those warships with all the oars, were fast, could turn on a dime, and they could ram enemy ships with devastating force. It wasn't just about winning on land, they had to control the sea too. Exactly. Land and sea, that was the key. And that combo of tough hoplites and a strong navy, well, it was going to make a big difference in the battles to come. Okay, so the stage is set. Two empires about to collide, different ways of fighting, and the fate of Greece hanging in the balance. Let's start with the first big showdown, the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Marathon, that's the one that really changed things. The Persian king Darius, he wanted to teach Athens a lesson for supporting a rebellion over in Ionia. So he sends his army across the Aegean Sea. They land at Marathon, this plain about 26 miles from Athens, and that's where we hear about that famous runner Phidippides, right? Ran all the way to Sparta to ask for help and then ran back to fight. That's the story. It might be more legend than fact, but it captures how desperate things were. The Athenians, outnumbered but ready to fight, they march out to face the Persians at Marathon. What about those Spartan reinforcements? Did they show up in time? Unfortunately, no. The Spartans had some religious stuff going on, some rituals, so they were delayed. The Athenians were on their own, facing a much bigger Persian army. Didn't look good for them. How did they manage to win? Their victory at Marathon is all about courage, strategy, and maybe a little luck. Their leader, Miltiades, he comes up with this brilliant plan. They weaken their center, make their flanks really strong, and then they charge. So instead of just charging straight ahead, they outsmarted the Persians, took advantage of their overconfidence. You got it. The Athenian flanks crush the Persian archers, then they close in on the center, and it all turns into this crazy brawl. The Persians are defeated, a huge upset, sends shockwaves through the Persian Empire. Yeah, I bet that stung. Marathon became this symbol of how tough the Greeks were, how a small, well-trained army could beat a giant one. It showed the world what the hoplite phalanx could do and how clever the Athenian generals were. But of course, the Persians weren't going to just forget about it. This was just the beginning. Yeah, that brings us to the legendary Battle of Thermopylae, right? 300 Spartans holding off a massive Persian army. Thermopylae, that narrow pass in central Greece, that's where things heat up again. 10 years after Marathon, Xerxes, Darius' son, he's out for revenge, launches this massive invasion, wants to crush the Greeks once and for all. Talk about holding a grudge. The Greeks knew Thermopylae was important, so they send this small force, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, to hold the pass and slow the Persians down. Classic underdog story. A few brave warriors against an unstoppable force. What happened? For 3 days, those Greeks, with the Spartans leading the way, they held off the Persian attacks. It was amazing, their discipline and ferocity. But in the end, betrayal did them in. A local shepherd showed the Persians a secret path so they could get behind the Greeks. So courage and skill weren't enough. It's a tragic ending. But their sacrifice, especially those Spartans who fought to the death, it became a symbol of courage against impossible odds. A story that still resonates. Thermopylae shows us that even when you lose, your honor and sacrifice can inspire people for generations. But the Persian army kept moving. What about Athens? Well, after Thermopylae, Athens was wide open. The Persians marched south and burned the city to the ground. Must have felt like the end of the world for them. It was a devastating blow, but the Athenians, led by Themistocles, a brilliant general and politician, they'd planned for this. They got most of the people out of the city and moved their fleet to the island of Salamis. So they were playing it smart, setting a trap for the Persians. Exactly. Themistocles knew the Athenian navy was their strength. He knew those narrow straits at Salamis would be a problem for the Persians. Their big ships wouldn't be able to move well in that tight space. So it was a gamble, using their navy to turn the tide of the war. A bold move, but it worked like a charm. The Battle of Salamis, a huge victory for the Greeks. Their smaller, faster triremes were all over those big, clumsy Persian ships, smashing them and sinking them. Can you imagine what a scene that must have been? Ships crashing, men yelling, the whole thing playing out on the water. It changed everything. The Persians lost control of the sea and their invasion was basically over. From Marathon to Thermopylae to Salamis, these weren't just military wins. They showed the world how tough the Greeks were, how smart they were, how much they loved their homeland in their way of life. And for the Athenians, those victories were extra special. It was like their whole democracy thing had been proven right. They showed that a government by the people could beat a tyrant. It's an incredible story, how wars, the bravery of individuals, and powerful ideas can shape the course of history. As we think about these ancient battles, here's a question. Could Athenian democracy, this experiment in self-rule, have survived if they hadn't won those wars? That's something to think about. Did their military success strengthen their democracy, or was it the other way around? We'll leave you with that thought. But one thing's for sure, the ancient Greeks, especially the Athenians, they changed the world. Their battles, their inventions, their ideas, they're still with us today, reminding us that every choice we make, every battle we fight, every system we build, it can have consequences far into the future. We've seen how ancient Greece, from their city-states to those epic battles with Persia, how their military history shaped their own fate in the entire course of Western civilization. As you learn more about this fascinating time, consider this. How did geography, military innovation, and politics all come together to create the legacy of Greece and shape our world? That's definitely worth exploring, a journey through time that will always be fascinating and inspiring. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ancient Greece. We hope you've gained a new appreciation for their lasting impact on the world.